Before we begin, we want to give a content warning that we will be discussing sexual violence and other issues that may be upsetting and triggering. If you need help, please feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. Please take care of yourself. Hello, and welcome back to Teal Talk. I am your host, Lori Hamami, and I'm joined, of course, by my co-host, Taylor Ucker-Lauderman.
Hey.
I don't know about you. I'm feeling like I'm glimmering right now from today's conversation.
Yeah, I'm like jazzed up. I'm like, how can I apply this to some more comms work?
So what are some key takeaways that you grabbed from today, Taylor?
Oh gosh, so I have lots of notes here. Elliott spoke a lot about assessing readiness, which hit me. Also, alignment. You will hear that and a little more of what that means. But making sure we're aligning our ethics with the way that we're actually doing our work. Applying the Fry's model of consent to storytelling. Also, this idea of a composite case study or like combined stories to show a narrative that is true. Yeah, so many really cool things. I'm excited for everybody to hear.
I am too. I know we focused on some ways that stories can cause harm, but I think what I gathered at the end is that storytelling can be really healing, powerful, and deeply respectful if done in an ethical way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And of course, there's a little bit about me too in this episode. So,
all right, let's dive in. Today's conversation is all about storytelling, specifically ethical storytelling. In a field where stories have the power to shift culture and policy, it's critical that we ask, are we sharing them in a way that honors, protects, and uplifts survivors? Today, we're joined by Elliott Fullenkamp, an experienced storyteller and OAESV's Manager of Training and Technical Assistance, to talk about what ethical storytelling looks like, what we need to be cautious of, and how we can do better. So, hi, Elliott.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Of course. Honestly, I feel like we all grow up with stories. We hear them as kids. A lot of us become readers as adults. So I'd love to hear about your storytelling journey and how you became interested in stories in general, but also stories in relation to this work.
Absolutely. Well, I love this focus on storytelling. Obviously, this is one of my passion projects in our field, and I think that this is something that our field is more and more taking seriously as a strategy. And to me, it's really exciting. My major in college was actually English education. And I mean, that goes back to, for me being in high school and having some really critical proto-feminist conversations all around books and all around stories. And I've really come to a lot of my understandings of the world from stories, from survivor stories, from people telling stories on others' behalf. So in general, I've always been taken by the power of stories when it comes to learning and communication and just culture change. So there's always been a real value on stories. And when it comes to ethical storytelling and storytelling within our own field, I've had the honor of doing education within this field pretty much from the time that I started. I started in advocacy, but quickly transitioned to a focus of training new advocates and training the broader community. So I've seen a lot of different training styles and approaches, But really, a thread through a lot of what I've seen has been the use of stories, especially in our more effective practices. Really, I see a lot of storytelling that might not so obviously ring as storytelling to the people who are doing it. When it comes to ethical storytelling as a focus, I've seen a lot of storytelling. I've seen the amazing impacts it can have on learning and culture, but I've also seen some unethical storytelling. And so this has been a project of me putting words to that and sharing those reflections and that research with the world.
Yeah, there's this like dual nature of storytelling as both a tool and a risk.
Tool and a risk. Ooh, it's so true. So true. What does ethical storytelling mean to you in the context of survivor advocacy?
Funny for us all to be landing on tool as a word. That's actually a line in the blog post that was sort of the start of my sharing journey in this area. A line that I wrote was, storytelling is powerful. It's a powerful tool in our field. And like any powerful tool misused, it has the potential to cause harm. So for me, I've seen survivor storytellers speak in a way that it's so clear that this is something so empowering for them. I've seen minds change when somebody in a trainer position is sharing the story of our field or the story of a specific individual. What's important to me and what my focus has been in this project is thinking a little bit more broadly about what storytelling is, bringing more attention to the fact that we're storytelling all the time in our education work, in our fundraising work, just the ways we relate to the survivors we work with. I would argue that when you tell a survivor something validating, like in an advocacy interaction, and you share something like, actually, this is a really common experience, you're not alone, or X many people experience this a year or in our community, that's storytelling. It's just a little bit different than I think some people want to define or go to define storytelling. So I think storytelling within our survivor advocacy field can look like telling the story of survivors to the broader community, but it's really everywhere and in everything that we do, because storytelling is just so human. It just becomes sensitive in this context of survivor advocacy when we have such high standards for ourselves and high ethical principles that we want to uphold, like survivor-centered, trauma-informed. And so again, this has been a project of really teasing all of that out and seeing all of the ways that storytelling, one, shows up, and two, what are some considerations for how to do it in a way that, like you said to start off with, Lori, honors survivors, uplifts survivors, and just respects what we're trying to do here in this field.
I feel like we could go on a huge tangent and just talk about what is ethical, what's ethics.
That's a whole college course series.
To kind of break it down a little, do you think you could share maybe some definitions or examples of the difference between ethical and unethical storytelling?
Absolutely. So the reason I chosen to frame this conversation around ethics rather than moral or, like there's other ways you can frame these things. Actually, a conversation I have a lot when I give this presentation or when I engage with people on this topic is people saying, "Ooh, this is something I've had in my gut. I've had this gut feeling before." But what we find is that, our guts, our morals, like these can be really personal things. They can only take us so far when we're trying to advocate for change. So where I think ethics can, yes, be complicated, but also somewhat clear cut, is that we in our advocacy field have an ethical code, which is from the National Organization for Victim Advocacy. And so what you'll find if you engage with my work or my writing or my presentations is there's a lot of direct pulls from ethics that we've agreed to, and distilling that down a little bit to certain themes. Some things I've identified are, ethical storytelling uplifts confidentiality, survivor-centered practices, consent, accurate representation. It works against bias. It's trauma-informed. So those are really the core distilled principles that I think for our purposes we can think of as what we measure to. This is what ethical storytelling is when we can feel aligned in all of those areas. But I would say, as for a deeper dive, that we do have ethics in this field that are pretty clear cut and written. Obviously, there's always going to be dilemmas and different ways we want to apply those things. But I like that we have this starting place where all together we can be on the same page that working in this field means we're sharing these ideals in the form of an ethical code.
I think what's interesting to me about this conversation so far is when you hear the word storytelling in this field specifically, I'm always thinking of, oh, a survivor telling their story or a survivor sharing their story with one person, two people, a whole audience. But you've really brought to light this concept of like advocates telling stories all the time. If we're focusing on the survivor stories in this next question, what are some of the risks or unintended consequences of using survivor stories in advocacy or in fundraising?
I think this dual breakdown of what survivor storytelling is also something I've written some about, and I've broken it down into there are direct like engagement with survivors where survivors are independently posting on social media, they're telling their stories, or maybe it's through a survivor speaker bureau, or maybe it's just having one survivor that your agency's had a relationship with who wants to talk to the media. Or so there are a lot of ways, and I think you're right, this is what most of us think first to, where survivors are directly telling their stories. So I think there's some complications there. For some survivors it can be an extremely empowering experience. For other survivors it can be re-traumatizing. And I think it's important to uplift different ways that survivors can share their stories so that there's options, because like we don't know what we don't know. If we have one idea of what speaking out, embracing our voice, sharing our story, if the only way that we've seen that look or have had that made available to us is like, here's a mic, go talk to 100 people, or here, do a recording, that's just not going to serve every survivor. It can be not what they need for their story. And so some of the guidance that I've thought about and put out there about engaging survivor storytellers has a lot to do with assessing readiness and like co-creating that space where it's what that survivor needs. It shouldn't just be a one size fits all, here's a speaking opportunity, do you want it or do you not? I think the Fry's model of consent can be a good tool for us. So is it really given? Is it reversible? Is it informed? Is it enthusiastic? Is it specific? I think using those principles when you're working directly with a survivor, that's how we avoid some of that risk. There's risk in everything we do, always, but how can we co-create an environment where the empowering aspects of survivor storytelling shine, and where some of the risks of like it being re-traumatizing, where all of that is sort of safety planned around. So I just, to sum that up, say like safety planning is really important. And that's with if engaging with survivor storytellers directly. What you'll find, because that is so specific and challenging, and I think ethically we should be paying survivor storytellers. There's a lot of barriers to ethical direct engagement with survivor storytellers within our local communities, just in general. So I think another way storytelling shows up, which can be the more invisible way, is the stories that we tell about what sexual violence is. When we explain what sexual violence looks like at a population level, why are some groups impacted more than others? All of that is storytelling too. And so I think with fundraising, education work, sometimes it is bringing in a survivor from a survivor speaker bureau, or playing a video from a survivor that you found online where you've assessed that you feel that it's an ethical storytelling. But there are different sets of challenges in those two different realms, whether you're directly engaging with the survivor or you're sharing stories of the field. It can look like an individual person's story, or it could look like a broader message. Both are stories, and both do have some like challenges and strengths. That's why this was not a short form blog post as it was originally intended.
Do you have any examples that would help listeners understand negative experiences that storytellers have had? Or what is an example of something that could happen that is a reason why we would want to do this ethically?
100%. I think to answer in both of those realms, direct engagement, survivors can be triggered. Survivors can be set back in their healing journey. Survivors can feel coerced. Not that you are trying as, maybe their advocate to coerce them, but without careful framing, going through those, like the Fry's model, you might find that they felt pressured, their power dynamics at play. There's some maybe more readily available ideas that we can think of, like what would happen if you put a survivor in front of an unfriendly audience where they were feeling emotional because they just weren't ready. So I think there's some really clear risks. And I do think there's been some great progress in our field. And like, what does it mean to ethically engage survivor storytellers? So that's not all the way my lane, but I think there's some really great guidance there from some projects that we've done at OAESV with our Survivor Council. What I'll answer as far as like when we're doing a training, when we're doing fundraising, and we're sharing an example of a survivor success story or trying to paint a picture of how this harm looks and the impacts that it can have on a person's life. When we choose an example that reflects a very narrow rape script's like a specific term used in some of the research. It's basically the idea of like, this is what rape looks like. This is who it happens to. These are the circumstances. If we're following a very narrow rape script that's already reflected in the culture, that's not an accurate understanding of what sexual violence looks like. And yes, maybe you're playing on some feelings, beliefs, motivations that people already have. Like, for example, if somebody says, I really support the work that you all do at your agency because just these women and children, I just support women and children more than anything. Mm-hmm. It's great. I support women and children, and we are leaving behind so many survivors by just reinforcing that narrow rape script. So when it comes to ethical storytelling at those broader community levels, and sometimes we choose individual survivor stories to tell that broader story. So we should be intentional about centering the people who are most impacted. We know that the majority of sexual assaults do not occur when somebody who's a stranger jumps out of the bushes. There can be racialized elements to this. When we play into these harmful cultural narratives, consciously or unconsciously, it does not serve all survivors, and it leaves behind survivors whose stories are yet to be told. So that's where I want to encourage advocates and educators and trainers and just all of us at our agencies. When you're talking to your uncle at Thanksgiving about the work you do, I just want to challenge folks to really think about, in that short moment, how can you push the narrative that's true, that's accurate, that reflects the realities of our work. It can be easier to say, I work at the women's shelter, but you don't just work at the women's shelter, right? And how can we use those small moments of storytelling to further the goals and objectives of our field and to support all survivors?
I was going to bring up that example too of like stranger assault, the person in the bushes versus someone we know, because I do think about that a lot. And we don't talk about those statistics to diminish anybody's experience who has been, it was a stranger assault, right? That's still horrible. That does not take away from that. But a lot of people already know about that type of assault. We don't have people really understanding when it's acquaintance assault or family. And we can throw out stats all day, and stats have their place. And I love data and everything. And some people really need to see that. But a lot of times people really aren't going to understand until they hear that other story that they've just never heard anything like that before.
I mean, we can bring statistics to life in our storytelling. I think that connects for so many people. Some people are numbers and data and facts, and that's what they want to see. But I would say most people, at least on some level, those really start to click when they see it in reality. And I think those of us who've done advocacy work know that. We know the impact of not just hearing the statistics when you're in training, but like working with someone and seeing the impacts of sexual violence, or when you see all those intersections. So we want to share that with folks. We want to give them that opportunity to learn those nuances, and people are ready for it. It can feel easier to like reach for those cultural narratives that people already connect to, but who are we serving when we do that? And who are we leaving behind?
I think sometimes it's maybe a coping mechanism to just believe that it's the stranger in the bush because it feels so impersonal. You don't want to think about it being people in your community.
Absolutely. To what, Taylor, you were saying about this still does happen and it's horrendous. I mean, people do go through these more well-known rape script scenarios, and sometimes they're well-known because it's really some of the most extreme things that we can think about, but we can't compare people's traumas. Like, people who experience sexual violence, who experience trauma, like, it's not about ranking it. It's not about, well, we need to showcase the worst of the worst, only worst of, I'm using air quotes there, but right. I think showing a variety of ways that this looks and using those statistics as a way to frame things can be helpful. And something I do encourage specifically, just as like a tool or a tactic you can walk away with is when you're telling survivor stories, it does not have to be just one survivor's story. It doesn't have to be a true account of ABCD and this is what happened. There can be like confidentiality reasons for that. And then also it can be an opportunity to create what I'd call like a composite case study. So you can take data and information in real elements of real stories. I'm not telling you should make stuff up, but you can look at things like who are we serving the most in our community? We can look at statewide statistics, we can look at national statistics, and we can use those details and meld a story that maybe isn't factual in the sense of it's one person's factual experience, but is true. The reason narrative is a word I keep using is that it has that connotation. Narrative is a story, but there's a connotation that you're crafting it or that it's maybe political in some way. I think sometimes we try to get away from the political nature of the work we do. And I'm not saying partisan, I'm saying political. We are changing culture. And so using the word narrative reminds us of the weight that we hold, the weight of being a storyteller and being a steward of stories.
Mm. When I think of political, I think of power and how power moves along throughout society and how power is used. And so that's a reminder that narratives are powerful. They're a way to shift power. They are a big tool. So, how can organizations respond when they get it wrong?
What if someone's listening to this and they're like, well, we've been doing it wrong this whole time. How do
What
we
I'd say
pivot?
is it's okay. You know, I think there can be so much shame just in general for anything, right? Where we feel, oh shoot, I've done something wrong. I've caused harm. And yeah, it's within our ethics, right, to just like do our best to cause no harm. And we're humans and we've inherited things. I think a lot of unethical storytelling I've seen looks like, well, this is the video we've been using to show what this looks like for the last 15 years. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Applying some critical thinking, right, to these things and just reevaluating, right? Respecting the work you do, respecting survivors, and respecting the weight of what you do. And it can be hard when we have busy schedules, but I'd encourage folks to, with as little shame as possible, just sit down and assess and think. And some of my work, I've written out some alignment questions. So alignment is a concept. And this is where I am kind of coming from my specific lens of being an educator and creating trainings and creating educational exhibits and opportunities. But I think this cross applies in anything that you're doing, fundraising. But alignment is this idea of figuring out what are your objectives, what are your tactics, and how do you get there then? How do you build activities, elements that build towards your ultimate goals? I think that can be the first step for a lot of people. It's just asking those critical alignment questions. How does this respect confidentiality? How does this respect survivor-centered practices and consent? Is this a recorded video of a survivor that we've been using for 10 years? Has anybody checked in with them? Are they still okay with us using this? It's just an example, right? But alignment, I think is something that can help us guide that process of making changes. So that's what I'd suggest is I encourage you to read the blog post. I would be happy to chat, especially with any of our members, about what this looks like, bringing our practices up to alignment, what our standards and our goals and our values are. But the first thing I'd say is like, don't kick yourself because that's not serving anybody.
Something this conversation is bringing up for me, which perhaps it's a little bit off topic, it still has to do with stories, but I'm thinking of media pressure, even unintended media pressure, something like the Me Too movement. It's addressed all the time. It was an amazing movement that encouraged a lot of survivors to come forward. You always hear things about that, where if one survivor comes forward, other survivors might have the encouragement to also come forward, which I think can be positive in a lot of ways. But at the same time, there's this very important idea that survivors don't owe us their stories. And I know from people that I've spoken to, they have this feeling where they never want to share their story. They never want to express their survivorhood. But if they don't, are we somehow sharing with them that like to be like you have to share your story to help other survivors? You know, why does every survivor have to share their story to help the movement. So I think that's just like tricky grounds to navigate too. I mean, even in our work, when we do our annual reports, we love to hear feedback from survivors and how we've helped them. And, we can keep it anonymous, but where's that balance between asking for it, encouraging it, and then just letting it be if we don't get it?
Yeah, I think this conversation around like Me Too and the ways that uplifted storytelling. I mean, honestly, that probably, not an anthropologist, I've not done this research, but just sitting here thinking about it, I think it's probably the evolution of our work, including more and more survivor voices, probably is directly correlated to that. The idea that sharing your story is really one powerful way to impact change. But it's like two things can be true at the same time. Exactly what you're saying, Lori. It's not the only way to impact the movement. It's not the only way to support survivors. And being out about your story doesn't have to look like posting it on Twitter or X.
We say Twitter around here.
It doesn't have to look like being ultra out about it. It can look like quietly using your voice in different spaces where that feels aligned and making those opportunities available and known to ourselves and to our communities that, hey, there are other ways for you to be impactful. I entered this field doing advocacy work right as the Me Too movement was really starting. And I remember making a very 20-year-old Facebook post about, I was a very earnest Facebook poster at the time. I made a very earnest post that I stand by. Just because this is happening and it's impactful doesn't, like, I see you survivors who are quiet right now, and I support that, and that's okay, because it was an interesting dichotomy of this happening in our media and our culture, and then also actively in a 40-hour training about confidentiality and survivors not needing to share anything they don't want to. Acknowledging that, Lori, is a huge first step, and then making some other avenues available. Are there volunteer opportunities that you can uplift? I've worked with survivors who, again, this is a story I'm sharing right now, actively, right?
So meta.
But I've worked with survivors who want to volunteer and do this work. And where I'd worked previously, there were both advocate volunteer position and behind the scenes donation sorting. And we've had some folks start wanting to do that direct advocacy because that's, to them, right, maybe the most clear way of, this is how I make a difference. This is how I give back. And it just wasn't right for them. They did the training, maybe they started doing it, and they were actually able to find service and alignment and fulfillment and healing in sorting donations that are going to help support survivors who are in earlier space in their healing journey. And so storytelling can look a lot of different ways. Storytelling is not the only way to make an impact. And I think uplifting that, making opportunities for that is huge.
It's something I always think about when we use taglines at the coalition, like embrace your voice. Our theme this year has been voices of change, right? It's very much based around that. And we do try to work in messaging with that to acknowledge over and over that there's more than one way to use your voice. And we don't always even mean literally, right? We value and respect and need everyone, no matter how or if they're going to share their story. But I'm also still just sitting with the fact that Me Too is a story, just the two words, because that is how folks shared it, right? Was like, you didn't necessarily share your whole story. You just said, Me Too. I'm like mind blown right now that those two words are so many stories. I love it. Mm-hmm.
I got goosebumps. The shortest story, but the longest story.
Yeah.
And we're doing, right, this look back to, how could have Me Too maybe put pressure on people? I also think that probably gave a lot of people permission of like, hey, I could share my story with 2 simple words and a hashtag.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not to detract from how powerful that was.
Mm-hmm.
It's the nuanced aspect of storytelling, right? It's not one solution of this is what ethical storytelling looks like. It's a process of alignment, and it's a process of choice and options, because we can't just say, well, they have the choice to say yes or no to sharing the story. It's about giving choices and creating spaces and creating opportunities and ways to think about things. And that's the mission of our work. Yes, it's serving survivors, but it's also working towards an end of sexual violence. I think that culture change looks a lot like handing survivors mics, but handing survivors a lot of other tools to make a difference as well.
Literally the perfect ending. Wrapped it up with a bow.
There's a lot of little good things, like just such good nuggets in there. Just thinking, like there were so many cool things that you said, Elliott. Can't wait to see the reels that come of this. But
well, if you're anything like us and you want more of Elliott, I suggest checking out the Quiet on Set Part 1 episode where we did talk a little bit about ethical storytelling there too, and the long form blog post on oaesv.org/blog. Elliott, feel free to plug away any other avenues that folks can get in contact with you.
Yeah, well, this is probably not going to be out in time for you to catch me speaking at the NOVA conference next week. So, but hopefully some of you caught me there. And I've done a workshop now, 60, 90, and 75 minutes versions of a workshop, teasing all of this out. And in that, I do give a lot of specific guidance on alignment questions around each of those different principles. How are we making sure we're aligned with confidentiality, trauma-informed, accurate all of these different aspects? I think, yeah, the blog post is a really great tool, but if you want like a bullet point situation, my presentation, I think, does a good job at distilling it down a little bit. I'm considering creating a resource on that so that it's a little bit more accessible to folks. So you can always reach out if you haven't caught any of my presentations. I'd be happy to have your input on what you want and what would help you around aligning your storytelling practices with your ethics. So yeah, reach out. Happy to give that presentation again or just provide that TA. I love working with you all.
Hey, I'll pop your email in the show notes too.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks for listening to Teal Talk. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into intersectional issues affecting survivors in Ohio. If you like what you heard, subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating and review, recommend us to a friend, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at OAESV and Twitter at Ohio Alliance ESV. If you'd like to learn more about us and the services we offer, sign up for our email list, or read a transcript of this episode, visit oaesv.org.
Want to share a comment or ask a question for a future episode? Just click on the link in the show notes to leave us a voicemail. And remember, we're here to help. Feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. See you next time.